State situation just continues to get crazy, Jack. And now we've got criminal trials coming up for 3 people, Curley, Schultz, and Spanier. And, of course,
Three Stooges.
That's the way they look at it up there. And I can't wait for the evidence to come out because I don't believe there is any. And John Ziegler from framingpaterno.com joins us live. Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing well. Good to be with you guys on your brand new show.
Well, we appreciate you coming on, John. And I read your book. You've got a book online now. And also these trials that I just mentioned are coming up, the criminal trials. Of course, the Penn State Board of Trustees has filed a lawsuit as well, which, by the way, John, I don't know if you had a chance to see that lawsuit, but I have reviewed it, and it looks solid to me. Some people think they need to add a defendant, Rodney Erickson, which I would agree with. But the lawsuit itself looks like it's on solid ground. I don't anticipate it'll get dismissed, and maybe we'll finally get some discovery going on and a deposition of Louis Freeh.
Well, that's certainly possible. Graham Spanier has sued Louis Freeh, which I think is an outstanding move because I don't think there's any logical scenario where he is guilty in any sort of a cover-up which didn't actually occur. By the way, people can get my free book. It's totally free online with no obligation at our website, www.framingpaterno.com. The framing is not literal. It's figurative. We don't believe in conspiracies, but I've devoted, as you know, Kevin, over a year of my life to trying to figure out what really happened here. And the reality is that almost everything the media has reported about this case is not just wrong, but flat wrong. And I hope that these various court cases will eventually show that perspective to be vindicated. We've already been vindicated to a certain degree by numerous occurrences, including, by the way, your friend Bob Costas going on the Tonight Show and saying he doesn't believe that Joe Paterno was involved in a cover-up, and Jay Leno actually kind of agreeing with him, which was kind of bizarre when Jay Leno has to be one of the few people willing to stand up for what the truth here is. But I think
what do you think the odds of Jay Leno having read their free report are?
Not about the same as Mark Emmert, actually. I think having read the free report, pretty much equal there. I actually would take Jay Leno's judgment over Mark Emmert's almost any day of the week. Having tag teamed with Franco Harris to run Mark Emmert out of an event here in Los Angeles late last year, where he refused to answer questions and ran out the back door because he was afraid of people who actually knew what the heck they were talking about. And I, of course, also had a similar experience with Rodney Erickson when I tried to question him a couple of months ago here in Los Angeles. The reality is, Kevin, the only people who want to debate this, the only people who want to talk about this, the only people who actually know the facts of this case, the people like us who are on the other side of this issue. All the media types who have long since decided that this case is closed and that Joe Paterno was a pedophile protector and the Penn State was flat guilty. For some reason, they never want to actually engage, and I don't think that's coincidental. It's because they're afraid. They know they don't know the facts. They know there's another side to this story that is much more consistent with the facts, and our side can actually tell a full story, which is what I did in that free online book, The Betrayal of Joe Paterno at framingpaterno.com. They can't tell a story. Louis Freeh couldn't tell a story because you can't make a story make any sense based upon their theory of events.
Hey, John, Jack Clark here. I'm from New Brighton, PA. Joe Paterno I was a big fan of his. There's no evidence anywhere. Penn State, the administrators obviously wanted to fire Joe Paterno, but do you feel that Joe Paterno will ever receive due process, in this whole thing, fair or not?
No, I don't. And, when I went on the Today Show, after I did my interview with Jerry Sandusky from prison, which I recorded and which people can see and listen to parts of it, you can actually read the 3.5-hour transcript. It's a fascinating interview at our website, framingpaterno.com. When I went on the Today Show, I said, Jerry Sandusky got his day in court. Joe Paterno never did. And that's maybe one of the most amazing elements of this entire situation, that a guy could live his life and his stellar career, 61 years in one place, never never be associated with any major scandal, be successful on and off the field, be revered, and in 3 days, without any real facts, have his entire life and career and legacy destroyed. And then, because we're in this move on, short attention span society where the media doesn't care about the truth, it's all about what's going to happen tomorrow. Forget about what happened yesterday. Where's the fresh meat? Where's the new story? Where are the ratings? We don't ever care to actually go back and say, hey, wait a minute, hold on. We rushed to judgment here. There's no facts to back this up. So I'm not optimistic, Jack, that we're ever going to actually get full due process. That's part of what I've tried to do. I know what Kevin's tried to do, if at least figuratively give Joe Paterno his day in court. And any semblance of a rational look at Joe Paterno's actions, I think, show that not only is there no evidence he was involved in a cover-up, which didn't exist, but I think that there's a great deal of evidence that he actually handled the situation better than anybody else who was involved. And frankly, what's most amazing is I believe, Jack, and I think Kevin would agree with me, that without Joe Paterno testifying truthfully on numerous occasions, I'm not sure Jerry Sandusky gets indicted. And ironically enough, there's no perjury charges against the Penn State administrators. So, I mean, that's the great irony of the media attacking Joe Paterno. Without Joe Paterno, there's no case, because Mike McQueary is forced to be hanging out on an island with no one backing him up.
And John, you and I have gone for over a year now trying to educate the general public on the way the media elite conducts its business. You actually spoke with a writer from Sports Illustrated who admitted that he made a crucial factual error in a story, and yet that story to this day remains inaccurate online.
And that's one of hundreds of examples, but it's a good one because it's Sports Illustrated, which supposedly is the premier sports publication, right? This was their legal reporter. He wrote, get this, and anyone who knows the case finds this laughable. He wrote that Jerry Sandusky raped a boy in 1998 while on campus. Now, anybody who knows the facts of the case knows that was never even alleged. And the case was investigated by law enforcement and was found to be not criminal and, quote-unquote, unfounded. Yeah, so I go to this guy. I said, look, you have screwed up. And he says, you know what? I apologize. You're right. That was an inaccurate statement. I go back to the web version of the article. It still has never changed. Because I guess to do that would admit that you were actually wrong, and they know that nobody else is going to notice it, and all the, and this is where the monolith that is the media mindset plays such an important role. Because if there were two sides to this story in the media's mind, Kevin, if it wasn't just basically the two of us screaming at the top of our lungs, then they might be fearful enough to go ahead and, you know what, I better change this because otherwise this might become an issue and I'm going to look like a jackass. But because they know 99.99% of the rest of the media sheeple are all on their side and they're lazy and they won't bother, they don't care. They honestly don't care.
And they know that no one will point it out. If I play a little word association with you here, John, I'll give you a name and you give me a reaction, okay?
Coach, go for it.
Matt Lauer.
Wow. Devious but competent.
Pierce Morgan.
Complete buffoon.
Louis Free.
Whore.
Tom Rinaldi of ESPN.
Sanctimonious fraud.
Mark Schwartz of ESPN.
Still running away from me? I would say delusional.
And we'll get that story in a moment. Joe Posnanski, who wrote the biography of Paterno.
Coward.
Scott Paterno, Joe Paterno's son, and a guy who has been fighting you throughout this process.
Wow, that's a tough one. I'm not sure I can do that in one word, but if I had to pick one word, I would say, or one phrase, in over his head.
Mike McQueary.
Not telling the full truth.
And the head of the NCAA, Mark Emmert.
Clueless.
The Penn State administration that fired Joe Paterno.
Gutless.
There it is. I couldn't agree any more with all of those.
Hey, John, you mentioned earlier the 61 years Joe Paterno in one place, the NCAA took away over 100 wins from him. Do you think we'll ever see a day with the NCAA gives Joe Paterno back those wins?
I actually, Jack, think that is the one area with the best chance for there to be some restoration of justice in the fairly short run, and I don't know what you're going to call short run. I mean, at the end of my book, I actually go through and I give a percentage to all these things actually happening, and I believe I think I said that there's a 60% chance that the win record gets restored within the next 20 years, and the reason I believe that is because it's so absurd. I mean, really, it's just so ridiculous to take out this magic eraser for something that had nothing to do with on-the-field activities or trying to gain a competitive advantage on the field. It's. I think even the average person looks at that and goes, well, that's just silly. And not only is it silly, it is actually absurd because those wins start to get taken away in 1998, which makes absolutely, positively no sense whatsoever based upon the facts of the case, because it would presume that Joe Paterno would have to take an assistant coach who had been investigated and found not to have done anything wrong by law enforcement, and I guess he would have had to have fired him at that point, magically knowing he was a pedophile, when in fact he was considered to be a saint of State College because of his charity work and his work with children. That is extraordinary. And I think it is the smoking gun that shows how ridiculous the entire NCAA sanctions are.
John Ziegler is with us. FramingPaterno.com is a very informative and entertaining website as well if you want the facts of this story. And, folks, it's difficult to get through the free report. I know that most people don't want to read it and don't perhaps not have the time to read it. But if you want to comment on this case, you ought to read it. And you certainly ought to read what's at FramingPaterno.com and John's book. And, John, in the final chapter of your book online at FramingPaterno.com, you pose a number of questions, all of which would have to be answered in the affirmative for there to have been a cover-up. And something that strikes me with these three criminal trials coming up with Spanier, Schultz, and Curley, if there had been a cover-up, as Louis Freeh alleged, wouldn't one or more of them have flipped on the other by now?
Well, and that's a great point because it's something everyone can understand. And to me, I try to tell this to people on our side who get antsy, right? Oh my God, well, maybe there's more evidence out there. They just haven't brought it forward. I said, well, okay, but you're still never going to get a criminal cover-up unless one of two things happens. Unless Mike McQueary, the main witness, says, I was told to shut up and here's how I was rewarded, which, by the way, he has made it clear that's not the case, even in his lawsuit against Penn State. So you don't have the main witness involved in the cover-up. So that's number one that makes it almost impossible to have a real cover-up. But to your point more directly, you're never going to have a real cover-up in this situation unless and until Spanier, Curley, and Schultz, or more likely either Spanier and or Curley and Schultz, flip on each other. You can't have a cover-up. Here's why. Take it in your real life. Think about this in real-life terms, folks. Here's how we know it's ridiculous. Either the cover-up started with the president of the university, an abuse victim himself, by the way, deciding to go to Curley. When Curley and Schultz come to him with this problem, he says, let's cover this up for this guy who's an ex-employee who no one likes. As bizarre as that is, I mean, we know that is obscene, it's ridiculous, but let's pretend it happened for a second. If that did happen, what would be the first thing that would occur once they got indicted and Spanier was fired? They would flip on him. They would say, he told us to do this. He was our boss. And they would get a plea bargain, and the whole thing would collapse on itself. The other scenario is Curley and Schultz decide on their own to go to their boss and say, hey, let's cover this up for this guy that nobody likes, this ex-employee. By the way, who goes to their boss, a president of a university, and says, let's do a criminal cover-up for a guy who's an ex-employee who nobody likes? That's ridiculous on itself. But if it had occurred, then guess what would have happened then? Spanier would have flipped on them. So because that's never happened and it's not going to happen, we know logically there cannot have been a real cover-up in this case.
Hey, John, how much blame does ESPN's Mark Schwartz for his media role in this for the negative portrayal of Joe Paterno?
Well, the reason reason I went after Mark Schwartz, and it's a hilarious video that people should, if they have not seen it, they should go to framingpaterno.com, watch our mini-movie, which is, again, free, no advertising, no nothing. It's very informative and entertaining. In the middle of that mini-movie, I go after Mark Schwartz. Weekend that Kevin was actually there last year, the first home game at Penn State last year, when bizarrely Mark Schwartz was the sideline reporter. And the reason I went after him after the game, after he'd done his job, was that he was the guy who had the tape in the Syracuse Bernie Fine case. He had a tape of the wife of Bernie Fine talking to one of the accusers, saying that she was well aware, that he and others had been abused by her husband. And yet he did nothing with it. He didn't go to authorities. He didn't report it. He didn't do anything.
For years.
And for many years. You're right, Kevin. And my whole point on this was, wait a minute. You called Joe Paterno a pedophile protector. Okay, if that's the case, how are you not also a pedophile protector? By the way, people might misunderstand me. I can understand, it's easily done in this complex case. I actually think it was somewhat rational for Schwartz not to do anything with that tape. It's just he ended up being wrong in retrospect, because it turns out Fine apparently was a child molester and got fired by Syracuse University. But here's the thing. The hypocrisy is just staggering, that you could ever say, well, wait a minute, I was just trying to be fair, and, I didn't want to jump to conclusions, rush to judgment. I felt like I needed more information. Well, if that's the case, Mark Schwartz, then why didn't you give that to Joe Paterno when you had far more, I believe that tape was far better evidence of abuse by Bernie Fine than Mike McQuarrie coming to Joe Paterno with a 3-second – people need to understand this. McQuarrie says he saw for 3 seconds through a mirror Sandusky may be doing something sexual with a boy. That is, to me, not nearly as powerful as getting an audio tape of the wife of the accused talking to one of the accusers saying, I know you guys have been abused for years. I mean, come on. And yet Schwartz does nothing, and he runs away from me hilariously when I go after him. And after he is already, along with the rest of his buddies at ESPN, many of whom, by the way, just happen to be Syracuse grads. I'm sure that's a coincidence, Kevin.
Yeah.
Many of them happen to be Syracuse grads, have crucified Joe Paterno when he knew far less than what ESPN and Mark Schwartz did. I mean, to me, it just crystallizes ESPN's agenda here. It was all about ratings, and they don't care about the truth. And if you read the book, I tell an interesting story about Tom Rinaldi and Jay Paterno, which I think exposes ESPN for the frauds that they really are.
John Ziegler is with us from framingpaterno.com. John, how do you expect these criminal trials to go? You watch the judge, which we knew would certainly not agree with any of the motions for dismissal. That was never going to happen because it's too much of a hot potato for that judge. And now all three of them will face a criminal trial. It doesn't, at least on the outset, it doesn't appear that the prosecution has much evidence, though they don't always tip their hand in those preliminary hearings. But I can't imagine, knowing as much as we know about this, that there's any smoking gun out there against any one of these three.
No, there's no smoking gun. As I keep saying, silence is golden for our side here. I think one of the most important things that happened at the preliminary hearing was that and think about, this is an incredibly important thing, although it's somewhat complex. I'll try to give the Reader's Digest version of it. To me, the most important thing that happened there was that when the defense tried to ask the lead investigator whether or not he knew the identity of victim 2, the boy in the so-called McQuarrie episode, the prosecution went bananas twice, vehemently objecting to that question even being asked. Forget about it being answered. The investigator did not want to answer it. And the reason why they didn't want to answer it is because, as I prove at our website with the statement that he gave on the day Joe Paterno was fired, that boy, as a 24-year-old married Marine, made a very compelling statement to an FBI-trained investigator, former police officer, saying that McQuarrie is lying and that nothing sexual ever happened that night between him and Jerry Sandusky. The prosecution has tried to claim or pretend that man does not exist. Well, what that told me, Kevin, was Well, that man has now claimed to be an abused person in this case. He has not changed his story about McQueary lying and that nothing happened that night. That, if it turns out to be the case, destroys the entire prosecution case. And to more directly answer your question, it is my gut instinct that eventually the Cynthia Baldwin issue is going to gut the prosecution's case from a legal perspective. It's a very complex issue, but that issue has not yet been decided. If it is decided the way most legal experts expect, then I think they're going to be forced to basically dismiss the charges, and I think they're going to let the media do their dirty work for them and just say, you know what, we tried our best. We had it dismissed on a technicality, but obviously they were guilty and bad people, and the media will be more than happy to do that work for them, unfortunately. I think that would actually be the worst scenario for us and for the truth. I want to see this trial go forward because I think it'll expose the prosecution case for the fraud that it is.
And, John, before we let you go, I know that Scott Paterno and you have engaged in some feisty emails and conversations, but the latest is that you offered to debate him. How did that turn out?
Well, just to be clear, he on Twitter, took a veiled shot at me for not, basically not being right about all of this and my theories. And I said to him on Twitter and an email, I said, Scott, look, I'll give $10,000 to your abuse charity, which he talks about all the time, if you'll just debate me publicly. And I'll also take down the website, framingpaterno.com, if you can just show me that I'm wrong. If you can show me I'm wrong, which I'd be thrilled. If I'm wrong, I want to get to the truth. Just tell me how I'm wrong. Well, Scott emailed back and said, I will go on Slaten's show with you if you give $150,000 to charity. Which I guess was the number he figured I couldn't meet.
Right.
That way he wouldn't have to actually debate me on your show, which I thought was hilarious. Who counter proposals a charity offer by $140,000? He also tried to tell me there was one thing in my book that was incorrect, which he was completely wrong on because he didn't even understand which episode I was referring to. So both offers still stand. I'm not going to come up with $150,000 for charity, but under the right circumstances, I'll give $10,000 to charity if Scott will debate me about this publicly, and I'll take down framingpaterno.com if he can just show me how I'm wrong. And I mean that sincerely because I want to get to the truth here. I have no agenda. Clearly, it's not to help the Paterno family if you listen to Scott Paterno. I just want to figure out what occurred, and I think that we're closer than anybody else to doing that.
John, before I let you go, final question. Most people out there scratching their heads right now thinking, well, wouldn't Scott Paterno be in favor of the work you and I have done? Why is Scott Paterno at odds with you?
Well, I write about this extensively in that free book, The Betrayal of Joe Paterno, but I think the short answer to that is that Scott Paterno is actually intricately involved with and partly, if not fully responsible for, a lot of why Joe Paterno got himself into this problem. Scott Paterno was his lawyer at times and was also in charge of the PR response, which I believe at times was pathetic. And I think Scott Paterno knows that he's partially, if not mostly, responsible. And I think he also knows that I am one of the few, if not the only persons willing and able to expose that. So you do the math for yourself on what Scott Paterno's true agenda is here. I think he has picked a narrative and embracing the media's narrative by large degree that is not helpful and it's not truthful, and I believe it has checkmated Joe Paterno into never getting to the exoneration that he deserves.
John, as always, fantastic stuff. We appreciate it. FramingPaterno.com is the website, folks. You can find all kinds of information there, including a free book online that gives you everything you wanted to know about the Penn State story if you're interested in the truth. John, thanks as always, my friend.
Thanks, Kevin. Talk to you soon.
You betcha. That's John Ziegler from FramingPaterno.com.